Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be cracking open a psychology textbook.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, it's the 11th edition actually, so it's from back in 2015
Okay.
to explore some really, really big ideas like intelligence and prejudice and how all this, technology that we're surrounded by is shaping our social lives. And
It's so fascinating how all of these topics are kind of seemingly distinct, but then when you really look at it, they all intersect in these like really unexpected
yeah,
ways.
for sure.
Hmm.
Okay, so first up is intelligence. And, we hear the term IQ all the time, and we tend to think of it as like this, fixed number that just like defines us, right? But looking at the research, it seems like there's actually way more to the story.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, and what really stood out to me was this concept of mental age,
Hmm.
which was developed by Alfred Binet over a century ago.
Wow.
He was actually trying to figure out a way to identify school kids who needed extra help,
Mm.
back in the day.
Oh, that made sense.
And that's how we got this whole concept of IQ in the first place.
Huh. And then Lewis Terman took that work that Binet did and he brought it over to the US, and that's how we got the Stanford Binet test, which is like still used today.
Oh, wow.
Which is really interesting. And I think those early tests, way back when, really sparked this whole nature versus nurture debate.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, is intelligence something we are born with, or is it shaped by, our environment and our experiences?
Yeah, like it's the classic question in psychology, right?
Totally.
And what's cool is that the textbook actually talks about this thing called the Flynn effect,
Okay.
which shows that like IQ scores have been steadily increasing around the world over time.
Really?
Yeah. It's kind of like how we've been getting taller as a species,
Mm.
but in this case, we're apparently getting smarter too.
Wow. So we're getting taller and smarter.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And, it makes me think about how all of these environmental factors are really playing a significant role, right? Like better nutrition, more stimulating environments.
Right.
Or even just the fact that we're living in this increasingly complex world, you kind of have to adapt to keep up.
Right, like our brains are being challenged to like evolve.
Exactly.
It really makes you wonder if like 100 years from now, people will look back at our IQ scores and be like, wow, they were practically cavemen.
Yeah, they'll be like, what were they doing back then?
Totally.
Mm.
So speaking of IQ tests, the textbook also like dives into the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale.
Okay, the ways.
Yeah, or the WAIS.
Yeah,
Which is like the most commonly used intelligence test today.
right.
And this is where it gets really interesting because the WAIS doesn't just give you this like one overall score.
Right.
It breaks it down into all these like sub-scores for different skills,
Oh, wow.
like verbal comprehension, processing speed, and like a ton more.
So it's not just about like how smart are you overall. It's
Right.
about understanding your unique cognitive strengths.
Exactly. Like, are you a wordsmith or a numbers whiz or a master of logic?
I love that. And you know what? This actually connects back to something that the textbook really emphasizes.
Okay.
It's this idea of test reliability and validity.
Okay.
You see, reliability basically means that a test gives consistent scores.
Okay.
So, like, if you take the same test twice, you should get roughly the same results.
Okay.
Like, think of it like a car, like a reliable car starts every time you turn the key.
Okay. Yeah. I got it. Reliability is consistency. So then what is the validity?
So, validity is all about whether a test actually measures what it claims to measure. Like, is it accurate? Does it truly reflect the thing it's supposed to be assessing?
Okay.
So think of it like a map. A valid map will accurately guide you to your destination.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay. So
Oh,
you've
yeah.
got to have a test that's both reliable and valid
Yeah.
to like really get a good understanding of someone's intelligence.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I've always heard that as we age, our intelligence starts to decline. Is that actually true?
Well, that's what a lot of people used to think, and some early research seemed to back that up.
Or-
Yeah. These were called cross-sectional studies, meaning they looked at different age groups at one point in time, and they found that older adults tended to score lower on intelligence tests.
Oh, wow.
But here's the thing. Different generations have vastly different experiences.
Right.
Like education, healthcare, technology, it's all changed so much over time.
Yeah, true. So it wasn't necessarily age itself that was causing the decline, but more like these generational differences.
You got it. And later research actually used longitudinal studies,
Okay.
which followed the same people over time, and it painted a very different picture. Like there's this incredible study that followed Scottish children from 1932 all the way to the present. And what
Wow.
they found was remarkable.
Oh,
Its intelligence remains pretty stable throughout life.
Wow, really?
And get this, they found a correlation of plus 0.66 between IQ scores at age 11 and age 80.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It really challenges that assumption that we just like get less sharp as we age.
Right.
But of course, not everyone falls within the average range of
Yeah.
intelligence, right? The textbook also talks about those at the extremes of the intelligence spectrum.
Yeah, that's important to understand the full spectrum. So,
Right,
for
right.
example, individuals with intellectual disability face specific challenges that require specialized support.
Right.
And the textbook mentions Down syndrome as one example, which is caused by an extra chromosome.
Right. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have these incredible gifted individuals
Yes.
like Moshe Kai-Kavelin, who earned his third college degree at age 14.
Oh, wow.
Like, that's a whole other level of cognitive ability.
Yeah, it's amazing. And his story really highlights how important it is to nurture talent and make sure that gifted individuals have the resources and opportunities they need to thrive.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've explored like how we measure intelligence and debunk that myth that it just fades with age.
Right.
But what about our judgments? Like, how do things like prejudice influence how we see the world and interact with each other?
Yeah, it's a really complex topic, but the textbook does a good job of breaking down how prejudice isn't just about like overt hatred,
Yeah.
you know? Right.
It can be so subtle, even unconscious, like woven into our thinking.
Hmm.
And it often stems from this like deeply ingrained need to believe that the world is fair.
Oh, like the just world phenomenon?
Exactly, like this idea that people get what they deserve.
Hmm.
Good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people.
Yeah.
And while that might sound nice on the surface, it can lead to some pretty problematic thinking.
Like blaming the victim.
Exactly. The textbook describes this one study where people were more likely to blame a date rape victim if they knew she was raped,
Wow.
compared to if they didn't know the outcome.
Really?
Yeah, like because something bad happened, she must have done something to deserve it.
Right.
It's like a way to maintain this belief that the world is just, even when you're confronted with evidence that suggests otherwise.
That's really disturbing. It makes you realize how easily we can fall into these traps of judgment without even realizing it.
Totally.
And it's not just about blaming the victim, right? Like there are all sorts of cognitive biases that can feed into prejudice. Absolutely. Like, for instance, we tend to categorize people.
All right.
Which is fine in some contexts, but it can lead to stereotyping.
Yeah.
We overestimate the similarity of people in other groups. It's called the outgroup homogeneity effect.
Okay.
It's like we see them as this monolithic block, all the same, while we recognize the diversity within our own group.
So it's easier to hold on to stereotypes when we don't really see the individuals within those groups.
Right, and this actually ties into the other race effect that we touched on earlier, where we're better at recognizing faces of our own race because we're simply more familiar with them. It's like a cognitive shortcut that unfortunately can contribute to prejudice.
It's fascinating and kind of scary how our brains create these shortcuts, even if they lead to inaccurate perceptions.
I know.
So what other cognitive biases contribute to prejudice?
Well, the textbook talks about the availability heuristic,
Okay.
where we tend to judge the likelihood of something happening based on how easily we can recall examples of it. So if we see like a news story about a crime committed by someone of a particular race, we might overestimate how often people of that race commit crimes,
Right.
even if the statistics don't support it.
Because that vivid, often negative example is readily available in our memory.
Exactly.
It distorts our perception.
Totally. And then there's in-group bias, this like automatic preference for our own groups, even when they're randomly assigned.
Right.
Like we favor us over them, even when the distinctions are totally meaningless.
It's like that saying, all's fair in love and war.
Right.
Our instinct is to protect our tribe, even if it means like bending the rules a bit.
Yeah.
But doesn't that create this us versus them mentality, which is at the root of so much prejudice?
It absolutely can. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these biases and actively work to challenge them.
Yeah.
We need to recognize that our perceptions are not always reality and that our judgments can be clouded by factors we're not even conscious of.
So we've got this deep-seated need to see the world as just, plus all these cognitive biases that can warp our perceptions.
Yeah.
Are there also emotional factors at play when it comes to prejudice?
Definitely the textbook highlights the scapegoat theory,
Yep.
which suggests that when things are going wrong, when we're feeling frustrated or angry or threatened, we look for someone to blame.
Right.
And often that blame gets directed at groups that are already marginalized, perceived as different.
Like when people lashed out at innocent Arab Americans after 9/11?
Yeah.
It's a scary example of how fear and anger can fuel prejudice and even violence.
Sadly, history is full of examples like that, and it's not always about overt aggression.
Right.
Sometimes it's more subtle forms of discrimination, like favoring your in-group when dividing resources, even if the groups are totally arbitrary.
So it's not always about hating the outgroup, but rather giving preferential treatment to us.
Exactly.
And it sounds like this can be fueled by frustration and aggression, especially when people are feeling economically or socially insecure.
Exactly. The textbook talks about how prejudice tends to increase during times of economic hardship, when people are more likely to look for someone to blame for their problems.
Right.
And that blame often gets misdirected toward minority groups who are often perceived as a threat to the majority's resources or way of life.
It's like a vicious cycle. Fear and insecurity breed prejudice, which leads to further marginalization and inequality.
It's a reminder that we need to address these issues systemically by creating a more just and equitable society where everyone feels safe and valued.
Yeah.
But it also starts with individual awareness and a willingness to challenge our own biases.
Speaking of challenging biases, does the textbook touch on how we can overcome these ingrained prejudices?
It does, and one of the most effective ways is through contact and interaction with people from different backgrounds. When we get to know people as individuals, it breaks down those stereotypes and allows us to see each other's shared humanity.
So we've talked about how prejudice can be fueled by everything from cognitive shortcuts to deep-seated emotional needs.
Yeah, it's really complex.
Yeah, it is. But now I'm kind of curious, how does this actually play out in our social connections? Especially with all the technology that we're surrounded by these days.
Well, it's interesting because technology kind of presents this double-edged sword.
Okay.
When it comes to social connection, on the one hand, it's never been easier to connect with people all over the world.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there's this growing concern that we're becoming more isolated,
Right.
like more glued to our screens than to real-life interactions.
Right. It's like we're so busy crafting our perfect online personas
Yeah.
that we're forgetting how to actually connect with the people right in front of us.
Exactly. And the textbook actually points to research showing that heavy internet users might actually be less connected to their real-world neighbors.
Oh, wow.
But here's the thing, it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
Social networking can also strengthen connections with existing friends and family,
Yeah.
especially those who are far away.
So it's not necessarily making us more isolated,
Right.
but maybe just shifting the way we connect.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And plus, there's research suggesting that online profiles generally reflect people's true personalities.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's not all just smoke and mirrors.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
So maybe instead of replacing real-life interactions, technology is more like an extension of our existing social circles. But does it change how we form those connections? What about attraction? What makes us like or dislike someone?
Yeah, the textbook actually dives into some fascinating theories on this. There's this thing called the mere exposure effect,
Okay.
which basically says that the more we're exposed to something, the more we tend to like it.
Oh, that makes sense. Familiarity breeds fondness.
Exactly like that song you hated at first, but now it's totally stuck in your head.
Yeah.
And you secretly love it.
Totally.
And it's not just songs, it applies to faces, food, places, pretty much anything. The textbook even mentions how we prefer our mirror image to photos of ourselves because that's the image we're most familiar with.
Oh, that's so weird when you think about it. Our friends see a totally different version of us than we do.
Right.
And there's even research suggesting that we tend to like people more when their faces subtly resemble our own.
Oh, wow.
It's called the "in me, I trust" effect.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so we're not just drawn to what's familiar, but to what literally looks like us.
Wow.
But that also makes me wonder if we're always gravitating towards the familiar. Does that mean we're less likely to connect with people who are different from us?
That's the danger, right?
Yeah.
If we only surround ourselves with people who look and think and act like us,
Right.
it can really reinforce our biases and limit our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
So the textbook emphasizes how important it is to have diversity in our social circles and to challenge our preconceived notions.
It's like that saying, get out of your comfort zone. But even with all this talk about connection, sometimes it feels like the world is just full of conflict.
Yeah.
What makes people act aggressively towards each other?
Well, the textbook points to a few key factors, like frustration, for one.
Right.
The frustration aggression principle suggests that when our goals are blocked, we experience frustration, and that can lead to aggression.
Oh, it's like when you're stuck in traffic and you just want to scream.
Exactly. And if there's a convenient scapegoat,
Right.
someone we already perceive as different or threatening, they often become the target of that frustration.
So prejudice can make people more likely to lash out when they're feeling frustrated or threatened.
Unfortunately, it can. And the textbook also talks about the media's role in shaping aggression, particularly the effects of violent video games.
Oh, yeah.
It's a hotly debated topic, but there is research suggesting that playing violent video games can increase aggressive thoughts and behaviors, especially in people who are already predisposed to aggression.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to think about, especially with how realistic these games have become.
It is a concern, but it's not a simple cause and effect relationship.
Right.
There are many other factors at play, like personality, family environment, social influences.
For sure.
It's important to have those conversations about media consumption, especially with young people, and to encourage healthy alternatives like pro-social video games or real-world activities.
Yeah, it's all about balance,
Hmm,
right? And finding ways to connect with others in a positive and meaningful way.
exactly. And speaking of positive connection, we can't forget about altruism.
Oh, yeah. Altruism, like, why do we help others even when it costs us something?
Right. The textbook explores different theories like social exchange theory,
Okay.
which says that we kind of weigh the costs and benefits of helping.
Right.
And then there's the reciprocity norm, the idea that we feel obligated to help those who have helped us.
It's like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Exactly. But isn't there also something more selfless at play?
Yeah, like sometimes people help complete strangers even if there's no expectation of anything in return.
Right. And that's where the social responsibility norm comes in.
Okay.
It's this idea that we have a responsibility to help those in need, even if they can't repay us.
Yeah.
Like, think about people who risk their lives to save strangers or donate to charities that support people they'll never meet.
It's inspiring to think about. We often focus on like the negative aspects of human behavior, but it's important to remember that we're also capable of incredible kindness and compassion.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we have the power to choose how we interact with the world and with each other.
Okay, so we've covered intelligence, prejudice, social connection. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, it has.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, I have to ask about emotions.
Oh, emotions, the spice of life.
Right, like how do we even begin to understand this crazy roller coaster of feelings we experience every day?
Well, the textbook starts by outlining some of the major theories of emotion.
Okay.
You have the James-Lange theory, which suggests that our emotions are actually driven by our physical responses. Like, we don't cry because we're sad because we cry.
That always seems so backwards to me.
I know, right? And then there's the Cannon-Bard theory,
Okay.
which says that physical responses and emotional experience happen simultaneously, so we cry and we feel sad at the same time.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense. But then there's the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory,
Right.
which throws in a cognitive element.
Exactly. This theory suggests that we first experience physiological arousal, and then we look to our surroundings to label that arousal. So if you're feeling jittery and you see a bear, you label that arousal as fear.
Right.
But if you're feeling jittery and you're about to go on a roller coaster, you label it as excitement.
So it's like the same physical sensation, but our interpretation shapes the emotion.
Exactly.
That reminds me of that experiment where they injected people with epinephrine, which causes arousal, and then put them in a room with either a goofy or an angry person.
Right.
And those of the goofy person reported feeling happy, while those of the angry person felt angry.
It's called the spillover effect. Our arousal from one situation can literally spill over into another and color our emotional experience.
That's so fascinating. It makes you wonder how much of our emotional lives is shaped by our interpretations rather than the events themselves.
It's a powerful concept, and it suggests that we might have more control over our emotions than we realize.
Okay, that's a great thought to end on. I feel like my brain is overflowing with new insights, and I'm definitely going to be looking at the world a little differently after this deep dive.
Me too. It's amazing what we can learn when we take the time to explore these fundamental aspects of human behavior.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more explorations into the fascinating world of the human mind. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.